Notes on Immanence and Nominalism in Postmodern Theoretical Discourse from Frederick Jameson's Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, Part 1, Immanence and the New Historicism. So what is the literary movement known as New Historicism? With Jameson mentions here, of whom we are presented with Walter Benn Michaels, the gold standard in the Logic of Naturalism, as an example. Well, Wikipedia describes it as a form of literary theory which aims at understanding intellectual history through literature and literature through its cultural context. Follows the field of history of ideas, which to me at least sounds like philosophy, in perhaps a new coinage arising from the 1950s, referring to itself as a form of cultural poetics. Regarding the book itself, written by Michaels and cited by Jameson, we read the frame of reference of the essay will surely strike un-American and European-oriented theorists as peculiarly Anglo-American, and as a return to just those English department concerns. What is the validity of this reading of the canonical poem or passage in question, from which the rest of us were in flight, and in place of which theory, in its structural or post-structural, or in its German or dialectical sense, promised the relief of new interests. Gadamer appears here to be sure, but as the rival of Hirsch. Derrida is here not merely because of his American connections, but above all on the strength of his polemic with Searle. It is as though naturalism now depended on having sound Anglo-American enemies. We would do well to keep in mind that the book in which this essay appears was published in 1991 by Duke University Press. Historically, a period which perhaps marks the return of the culture wars into mainstream prominence in America. Perhaps to a generation that was exposed to the possibilities of the internet for the first time, with issues such as conservatism, gun politics, separatism of church and state, privacy, recreational drugs, censorship, and homosexuality repeatedly coming up in college campuses, but also in houses of legislation and in courts. Something to be said on the count of culture, which can only be said via a form of cultural criticism, is perhaps a reiteration of the old refrain against the person of the critic themselves, who in their criticism seeks to present, as it were, the very presentability of a work to an audience or readership, dealing hence in matters usually intimate, such as taste and sensibility. The truth of their work, however, remains the object of criticism, which I have argued elsewhere seems to function as some sort of principal capital. And while an Althusserian Marxist such as Frederick Jameson, whose own mode of presentation would seek to perhaps focus on conceptual fulcrums that determine, as it were, the drive of a work, charting its directionality, perhaps in terms of the plot, he is yet circumspect enough to see that the antinomic role of criticism, which here perhaps approaches dialectical thought, engenders, to steal a phrase, its antinomy, citing, as it were, the provocative program against theory. This approach, as it were, does much to avoid skirting around issues as is the fashion of bear baiting, that is an unfortunate scenario in many oppositional struggles, often faced by groups who would be resistant minorities. As poetic a representation as criticism or opposition as truth may be here, it does lead to an alarming reassurance of Stanley Fish's that to stop doing theory will have no consequences whatsoever. Going back to Michaels and Knapp, who in their position against theory seem to ignore their target's most interesting problem. To quote, splitting apart terms that are in fact inseparable is so persistent a mistake to use their terms, and Michaels' own response to such efforts are that they are odd or weird. The resistance to theory, however, at a personal level to a theoretician would appear, as stated by Frederick Jameson, the erection of some kind of new taboo whose own motivations remain unclear, and yet a censure which proceeds to further mount itself. Now, when the annals of literary history are written, the tendency which in itself worked as a school of thought, at least as far as the study of texts are concerned, which New Historicism was responding to, was known as New Criticism, which instead of trying to historicize the ideas and milieus immanent to a text, sought to present a close reading, treating it as a self-contained entity, focusing, as it were, on formalistic elements such as composition or style. As an evaluative tendency, the new critics, among whom we may list I.A. Richards and T.S. Eliot, came across the prevalent currents of thought at the time, from Marxism to Freudianism, political readings and sociological generalizations, all of whom were resisted in some measure. And Jameson tells us that this was a time when even the philosophy departments were left unscathed by the continental currents of existentialism that were on their way from Europe. The only steadfast objectors to the school were an old-fashioned communism and an equally old-fashioned psychoanalysis. Immanence, the heart of what the new critics were after in their textual analysis, was to be found in poetry, the writing of it, but also its reading, which was, as it may, a good deal more exciting than theory. There is something which we scholars today may never know, of a proliferation of theories so extensive in the early 90s when this book was released, that would render the new critics' insistence on the separatism of the intrinsic meaningless. Yet with this also means the de-stratification of the seemingly stalwart, if archaic, theories of Marxism and psychoanalysis, themselves submitted to a kind of multiplicity, with which comes diffusion of their seeming extrinsicness. This brings us back, as it were, to the earlier and perhaps more ingrained problems of immanence and transcendence, within which the critics of New Historicism raise their interpretive and historically colored lenses. What do these interpretive vantages, for they are not mere methods, as each have decided preferences in terms of their subject matter, tell us about their proliferations, or perhaps event the possibility of something resembling that? A quote from the text should be indicative of the conjuncture. Quote, indeed, if there is any merit in characterizing the postmodern moment constitutively as one in which the traditional avant-gardes and collective movements have become impossible, then it seems possible that forms of resentment are at work in the denunciation of something that seems to be a collective movement of that older type, or is accused of passing itself off as such a movement, or its simulacrum. The post-contemporary moment, as it were, is indeed one which in its attestation to a lack of historicity leaves itself vulnerable to appropriations. And indeed, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable question as to what may have been a genuine avant-garde movement in the first place, though I am less sure as to why this movement would coincide with the affirmation of its structural impossibility. The resistance to theory, were we to read this as a kind of symptom as to what makes a genuine avant-garde disposition so difficult today, would be compounded by the particularity of the constraints or labels posed to an individual artist, critic, or writer, a situation that Sartre does much to foreground in his starring and indeed existential dialectics with the considerations of others. A certain feature of precisely a collective consideration in this sphere, that is, the position of the writer in the literary milieu, i.e., in the engagement with intellectual tradition, but primarily with the readership of his own time, which, as we may have characterized as postmodern, is the very denial of collectives, which here would refer to as structural collectives or classes, as such existing as far as the market is concerned only in their interrelation. Is this the price we pay for focusing on the immanence of a text, losing, as it were, its contextual or transcendental dimensions? This seems to be a position which Frederick Jameson would be inclined towards, even as he brings out that which is genuinely novel in the work of Sartre, for which I would recommend that you read his doctoral dissertation, Sartre, Origins of a Style. There seems hence, to me at least, to be a closure not merely of the possibilities of an individual work, which is itself disciplined, as it were, in its subsumption to collective business cycles, but also with the foreclosure of any genuine, radical, or collective change, a cheapening of the very possibilities that an artist, critic, or dare I say, a politician may have to behold before them. Indeed, this twin foreclosure, as it were, of the individual and the collective spheres, that is, the capacity for representation and reflection in any individual work, and its capacity to grasp the possibility of any real structural transformation in the public sphere, indeed a seeming meditation on this sterility, seems to be a feature which postmodernity, in spirit if not in letter, is often reduced to. Here, it may be tempted in some kind of activistic enthusiasm to question the capacity of this term to provide us with any kind of analytical or conceptual gain, and indeed be tempted to deal more explicitly with the structure of class relations themselves, perhaps in a form of revitalized Leninism, and such efforts would be well advised to recognize perhaps the more continental but also contemporary recognition among the human sciences of the rise of the security state, often known by other names such as the military-industrial complex, the police state, whose archetype, as it were, can be found in earlier literary examples such as Orwell and Hume, and which popular culture has seemingly ubiquitized with the Matrix and Foucault and whatnot. To present another quote, but the contradiction between immanence and transcendence remains as before, however the zeitgeist decides to handle it, and it is, if anything, intensified by the extraordinary systematizing and unifying forces of late capitalism, which are so omnipresent as to be invisible, so that their transcendent operation does not seem to pose the intellectual problem of transcendence itself so tangibly and dramatically as it did in the earlier stages when capital was less complete and more intermittent. End of quote. This completeness, as it were, may be a function of what I have elsewhere described as the cubicalization of relationships, a foray into the way the modularity of our workstations today seem to be pluggable into any kind of assembly apparatus. What is lost in such a perspective, however, is a properly institutional view which focuses on the global developments in a craft, for example, via whose augmentation the products made may be done so easier, more efficiently, or with fewer resources. Transmission being the key function that makes this available. But far more exciting in any case would be how such developments in individual disciplines of inquiry, for example, change the platform itself, particularly in terms of the new possibilities created. An example of this would be the contemporary, though perhaps increasingly less so, focus on interdisciplinarity, especially in the humanities. And we have yet to see in its entirety what new forms of narrative this will produce. These, coupled with perhaps earlier engagements, lead Jameson to place the gold standard as a specimen of new historicism and towards an effort to identify its movemental stereotype, an operation towards which he would suggest storytelling remains the best tool. Yet were a prominent feature of this movement to be emphasized, it would probably be this seemingly novel capacity of a text to reach the objects of other disciplines, making it possible to deal with them in new ways. In this new field of discursivity, political power, walking and shopping at a supermarket, Hollywood, star systems, genre, as well as the body itself, with its symptoms, deeper impulses, and sensory perceptions, become texts, readable and hence reconstructible in new ways, often liberating us from false problems, just as it produces new ones. At least a part of this new gamut is the question of how earlier totalizing fictions can be circumvented, as is the effort of just about every new generation in relation to custom, to say nothing of migrants and organizational developments. Indeed, this seems to be the phenomena which the immanence or intrinsicness of a text, let me just make this small change here, text, cannot hold up to, as the retention of some central principle, as it were, entails a continuity which implies the very concept of heterogeneity, inasmuch as at least an essential or vital and a peripheral or instrumental function can be attributed to the element of any composition in question. And yet each element in question, kinship, cultural tales, visual styles, or oral stories, can form texts in themselves, each with their own specific problems, which often reveal vital breaks when read side by side, when not problems of a qualitatively heightened type. The question to pose is if society as a relatively stable category is destabilized to the point where it can't effectively contribute to its subtexts, i.e., village level organizations, kinship, visual form, etc., then what conceptual edifice would we have in its place? Further, whatever this new concept may come to be, our own endeavor would be bound to individual disciplines themselves, within which a perspective thinker may discover homological structures that cut across them, working in each, as it were, perhaps not unlike how Levi-Strauss seeks to isolate the use of myth among tribes. Whether this concept is adequate to secure indifferent or non-hierarchical relations between the various subsystems may be a question subject to some attritional settlement. Yet it would primarily be a function of the discourse in question. Derrida may perhaps be baited into dwelling upon this, the various names of the structurality of structure, etc. Generically, however, the concept of structure suffices. In returning to the object of our study, Michael's and Knapp's manifesto, the intervention sees this as a call for a return to a pre-theoretical procedure, while simultaneously opening up a range of post-theoretical operations that retain the discursive conquest. Yet Jameson recognizes in this effort also the exclusion of transcendental interpretations that may once have been, perhaps, the purpose of the homologies. I am, however, less inclined to see new historicism as a return to a kind of immanence, especially as it leans on the concept of homologies, which in their very operation are neither singular nor purposive, and hence structural, a concept whose very form remains in the subtexts between which homologies are noticed. Inasmuch as these homologies, structural or otherwise, and inasmuch as they are structural, we may yet see in this a form of structural causality, or as Marx would term it, Darstellung. This concept, however, of structural causality, or Darstellung, is not merely and not necessarily interpretive, but determinative. That is, to put it in Althusser's terms, quote, by means of what concept is it possible to think the new type of determination which has just been identified as the determination of the phenomena of a given region by the structure of that region. End of quote, from reading Capital. For our present purposes, I would like to make two qualifications. 1. This statement hinges upon how we are to understand the concept of region. Here, it is used in a spatial sense, and that indeed is a pertinent position, especially regarding the borders between political entities, yet at a more prosaic and perhaps personal level, thinking the concept of region in terms of, for instance, a genre, discipline, or indeed personal narrative or history may awaken in the subject the sense of a narratorial unconscious, often identified by new critics as the unsaid of a text, yet whose presence lingers like perhaps some unarticulated oddity. This temporalizing of space, as it were, allows us to notice not merely the periphery, but perhaps the forgotten, and conversely, of course, the hegemonic. Hegemony, however, particularly in its exercise, is most often experienced spatially, bodily beings as we are, and as such we may have at some point to consider the kind of hegemony in operation and its nature. On the other hand, the inaugural moment of new historicism is noticed in the Renaissance self-fashioning, is noticed to be Renaissance self-fashioning by Stephen Greenblatt, whose striking characterization by the author leaves one wondering why some of the propositions were not further explicated. To quote, the work in hindsight looks like one of those classical and paradigmatic scientific discoveries achieved by triumphant accident in the process of attempting to solve a false problem, end of quote, likened here to Kepler and Galileo's Platonism. Regarding the titular work in question, Renaissance self-fashioning is read to be steeped in the conception of the self and identity, drawing admittedly from high modernism. As a singular work and as against much new historicist literature, it leaves aside self-consciousness or reflexivity for what is left as an intense theoretical energy, that's in quotes. In terms of the subject of composition, however, which itself seems to deconstruct, so to speak, the more official position on selfhood in the text, a quote suffices to indicate what may be found. Quote, selves capable of modifying their shapes so effectively that they ultimately call the very idea of the self into question. End of quote. Though how the pursual of this theme leads to the axis between theology and imperialism is less clear to me. Of interest to me here would be what kind of refashioning of the self is in question. Is it a refashioning which is inscribed in the practices of the self, or are we speaking about a transcoding, such as when cultural migration or appropriation takes place? It may also be possible to locate in the carrying forth of such functions a Foucauldian understanding of power, And perhaps there is something to be said about an authority which operates without signification, after the fact, that is, if power itself is the homology or structure we are referring to. As used in the text, Jameson detects that it does not serve an interpretive function, but rather seeks to produce a reassurance in the reader, allowing them to dwell in the detail without guilt or discomfort. Perhaps not unlike contemporary formulations of a night watchman state. In seeking to account for other major attacks on theory, such as from Ginsberg, the Annals historians, and E. P. Thompson's attack on Althusser, Jameson identifies what is admittedly a highly theoretical resistance to theory, a gesture which bears allegedly a marked similarity with the new historicists. What Jameson refers to as narrative anthropology, and what in other parts is known as ethnography, as promulgated by the likes of Clifford Geertz and Turner, serve as ready references to Greenblatt. This resemblance, as far as historians are concerned, is identified as an example of overdetermination, of those who have been following the references here, particularly Ginsberg and the practice of microhistory, which appears to be a form of historical anthropology, if not ethnography in any case, would identify the tendency which is alleged to have overdetermined them. For it may be possible to identify in these examples discursive gestures in terms of the focus of a study and its method, best exemplified in the questions asked and the method of pursuit of an inquiry, if you prefer, such as participant observation, homologies. Yet it would not be possible to piece together the motivations of the new historicists from these disciplines' studies. In his assessment of new historicism, Jameson recognizes its mobilization of historical attractions that are captured and redeployed, but are also repressed by a valorization of immanence and nominalism that can either look like a return to the thing itself or as a resistance to theory. Examples are presented to explicate this in Greenblatt's essay, Invisible Bullets, that raises rather contemporary concerns such as police surveillance, the Virginia colony, and the counterfeiting of gold coins, juxtaposed by Renaissance grammars, language teaching, and a Shakespearean mimicry of dialects. Each possible metaphors whose analogical polyvalence one can readily imagine exploited by this or that school. Along with this, we are presented with Catherine Gallagher's The Bioeconomics of Our Mutual Friend, that attest to such arch-conservative themes such as death, the 19th century hygienic movement, and the emergent conceptions of life, all constellated, as it were, under the sign of value. The subject of these essays, however, are real, not as interpretive possibilities, but this is as productive or vital functions, but rather as mere pretexts for the montage in question. Let me repeat this, The subjects of these essays, however, are real, not as interpretive possibilities, but, that is, as productive or vital functions, but rather as mere pretexts of the montage in question. This seeming negation, as it were, from the perspective of the New World at least, having witnessed the anti-Vietnam movement after the counterculture of the 50s and 60s, also, ironically, perhaps provides something akin to the Brechtian alienation effect, the German valence of this seemingly Anglo-Saxon phenomena. And yet this problem, as it were, this negativity, if you will, presents genuinely new representational challenges. Frederick Jameson himself, growing out of the golden age of Hollywood, asks, for example, of how new forms of montage and cinema can be related to pedagogy in a way which does not leave the sphere of this interaction merely at the register of the imaginary, but actually touches the symbolic universe of the viewer in a purposive and cogent way. Godard's films, for example, are presented as a way to depict consumer society and Maoist politics. The status and the ideas presented by Godard, however, are likened to those neo-historicist works within their limitations. That is, not as personal choices made by agents, but rather as part of some more general movement towards immanence and what Adorno called nominalism, a conceptual opposition to my mind, at least as the latter would indicate at least two levels of reference, like an algebraic operation, whereas immanence would primarily indicate self-encompassing capacity. In observing Godard's scene making, we are pointed out to the way in which discrete shots, such as an advertising image, interview with a philosopher, and the guests of this or that fictive character, may not necessarily be put back together by the spectator in the form of a message, let alone the right one. There may be something to be said here of the very shattered, to use a poor word, nature of a form in consideration. Yet also, and generically so, their singularity, its form, as it were, read by some contemporaries of evidence regarding the texture of experience and the possibilities it entails. Adorno exchanges letters with Benjamin, for example, on why he is reluctant to tell his readers of his historical constellations, what they meant and how to interpret them, perhaps indicating the incommensurability of depicting the scholiums that consist of the theses on the philosophy of history in any other way, relating to basically singularity of how something can be expressed. Yet the concept, or rather the form of the montage, is what Jameson chooses to stick with, as it seems more congruent with Greenblatt's project of the problematizing of the self in the gold standard and the logic of naturalism. In the author's efforts at characterizing characteristic tendencies in this book, three are identified. 1. The practice of the identification of homologies as is characteristic of new historicist discourse. 2. A polemic waged against liberal or radical discourse or interpretation which seems to recapitulate this position in against theory. 3. A proto-historical narrative representing something of the specificity of a historical period and also its waning or transformation into something else, the gold standard, ideology, etc., but also perhaps apparent in literary movements. The range of these homologies, however, ranging from medicine, land tenure, to money itself, makes this section, and indeed the suggestiveness of the original, the gold standard and the logic of naturalism, worth reading in its own right. This tendency, however, and perhaps the practice of homological notations themselves, are seen to be apolitical phenomena and are juxtaposed to imperialism, which more readily takes on the legacy of Marxism, as well as Foucauldian and third worldist politics, recognizing a sign of the potency still expressed in Greenblatt. What homologies may lack in terms of a cut of insight, however, they do make up in terms of their apparent ubiquity. And is this not at a discursive plane the hysteric position par excellence? It has been identified, for instance, that the repeated insistence of a demand has commonly been identified in the figure of the hysteric woman in literature, often parodied and caricatured, but no less sincere a representation because of it, even if such a figure is occasionally feared, or as feminists may put it, misunderstood. It is, however, in the repetition of a demand that the economic primacy of work surfaces, knotted, as it were, with the more philosophical problem of identity. A quote to offer to light the author's thinking on this would be instructive. Quote, "The economic question, how do I produce myself, and the therapeutic question, how do I stay myself, find their parallel in the epistemological question, how do I know myself? Security, hence, one way or another emerges as a dominant theme in the art of this age, reflecting as it were the subject's conquest of the uncertainties of the market, often found, at least since Victorian fiction informs us, in real estate and title deeds. And indeed, this search for the enclosedness of a dwelling, its sanctity as it were, may be read even in artistic innovations with daguerreotypes, the first form of photography, presenting the possibility of chemical fumes to form an impression on a light-sensitive copper plate, producing a portrait, for instance, which requires a more protracted development process the dimmer the luminosity of the frame. That seemingly negates the artistic interpretability of the brush, just as it offers a kind of permanence and exactitude, which were and are very desired qualities in our age of mechanical reproduction. This would also serve as a good example of a homology, and an emergent one at that, between forms of manufacture, property, and art, while also suggestive of how they influence each other. Indeed, via this, one of the chief social functions of art presents itself to us. That is, a chance to reconceptualize the relation between property and the self. And with this, the problem of the proprietorship of a thought, perhaps disputed these days under the name of intellectual property, too surfaces. A marginal note on a psychologist, it would appear, named James, who here I take to be the American pragmatist William James, is taken up, which also provides us with a way of thinking about intellectual tradition, or the history of philosophy if you prefer, in ways that do appear to bypass the often subsumptionary mechanism that a historically mediated conceptual thinking often produces. He would, James, for instance, call it a mistake to assume that the present thought establishes ownership over past ones. He would suggest in its stead that it already owns them. The title of the proprietor comes into being, as it were, upon the death of another owner. And yes, since we are talking about thought, the existence of the owner coincides with that of the owned. A thought hence transfers what is its realized self into its later proprietor, high metaphysics if there ever was one. This movement, as it were, is to coincide with another possibility, which is available in modern republics, which is the autonomy of contracts from the juridical level. For the purpose of my own study here, I will not be following Jameson's statements regarding Michaels's observations regarding the gold standard itself, which he eventually gets to apart from observing the belief in the natural value of gold is seen as the ultimate form in which the longing to escape the market is fantasized. If a theme emerges from these cultural observations, particularly the issue of a thought, character, and the proprietor as articulated by James, the point they would be leading to is the experience of the self as private property, and hence subject to the market. And with this, of course, would come the commodification of indiscernibles which are today becoming increasingly recognized even in courts, namely time and privacy. I am also skipping here some of Jameson's readings of American authors such as Hawthorne and Dressier, and what kind of correspondence or continuity may be traced between them and Balzac, for which you may have to read the chapter yourself. Michaels's conceptual adversaries in his text are Marxists for sure, but he also extends his critique to so-called continental theorists of desire, whose alleged force is supposed to undermine late capitalist rigidities. These forces may very well be the factors which keep the consumerist system going in the first place. This refrain, if you would call it that, would also be noticed in Foucault, who thought that if the system was indeed totalizing, a term an earlier generation of Marxists may have known as monopolistic, then all local revolts remained inside that, and hence a function of its immanent dynamic. This theme, as it were, namely the complicity of revolt, remains perhaps at that time at least most fully developed by Baudrillard. Marxism itself, in its orthodox configuration, thought of this differently, as the emergence of the conditions of real socialism within already existing capitalism, driven by contradictions immanent between the forces of production and the relations of production. Jameson asserts that even without ideals, the communards do have a program. In the liberal West, there appears to have been two kinds of reactions to the proliferation of the image, whose proliferation in times closer to ours has presented nothing short of a kind of diet cure for images, or what Susan Sontag calls a kind of conservationist remedy. Yet a puritanical conservatism, not without its own puritanical precedents, such as in Plato, would choose to suppress images altogether. And Sontag does observe that Maoist China too adopted this curtailment on images. There is even a sense of progress charted with efforts such as Michael's The Gold Standard and the Logic of Naturalism, which follows Marxist economists in the West, have sought to reintroduce economic and market debate back into cultural criticism. In terms of what Marxism can learn from this, in terms which probably aren't revisionist, is that Marx's analysis of capital is not a productionist one, and as early as in the introduction to the Grundrisse, he affirms the indissolubility of three dimensions of production, distribution, and consumption. Having said this, the emphasis on production, whatever that might mean, presents the most effective way of defamiliarizing the ideologies of the market itself. What is interesting about such a conjuncture, however, is that even as a vision of capitalism, the primacy of the market is the purest of ideological edifices. Liberal critics have held to a tendency to chastise Marxians, and perhaps even Foucauldians, for proceeding with their struggles against what is essentially a totalizing conception of the mode of production, likened perhaps to Don Quixote's jousting against windmills. Yet as even the Frankfurt School learned, it is more useful to proceed with a totalizing concept than without one, their own being, of course, late capitalism, whose homological valence Jameson does see in Weber's administered society. Regarding the issue of literary theory itself, the emphasis on authorial intent, which the program against theory emphasizes, the question to ask would be, how would we locate the logic of the market, inhabiting as we are a world of individual subjects and decision makers, which, if nothing else, is still a transsubjective logic, built as it is on transference. The unconscious, however, from where the logic of transference draws its conception, is not necessarily individuated to a subject. In fact, this was Lacan's decisive break with Freud, in demonstrating that the unconscious is structured like a language. There is indeed a way in which this unconscious in its transsubjective dimensions acts in excess to the intentionality of individual subjects, and as such, irreducible to a Husserlian phenomenology, as the subject is not the intent per se, but precisely that which is irreducible to it. Freud's own ruminations on these lay in slips of tongue, jokes, and dreams. However, is this all? Would not that abstraction which we call the market, demonstrate precisely such an autonomous choice, a function as it is of that other non-individual, meaningful, collective, yet impersonal agency, known by Marxists as the mode of production. The unity where these twin logics, those of non-individuated market forces and those of an orthodox reading of the mode of production, is cited as the trust, monopoly, or corporation, often creating its own new corporate laws. It abolishes individual actors of laissez-faire, ushering in a properly representative form of cooperation, often bridging the gap between production and consumption itself. Not very unlike the Lukácsian notion of class consciousness, corporations allow for an individual to individuate themselves as a subject, yet as such they would appear to be extensions of the corporation, and not the corporation as an extension of them. The coexistence of this seemingly collective form of organization, indeed many of them, with the market, is a most interesting, even if ironic, development indeed. The question which Jameson seeks to raise here is whether the corporation as such is seemingly only a single instance of the restructuration of the market, or whether in the form of subjecthood it extends to employees, offers something of a personhood which can exist in exteriority to the market. This would appear to be an extremely limited proposition, as corporations usually persist beyond the tenure of individual employees, whose very terms of employment are ultimately subject to the market. The most interesting question to ask would be whether the market as such, in accommodating and responding to the corporations, acquire via some sort of transference, mimetically or otherwise, characteristics which are personified. This is hardly an alien proposition, even as much as neoliberal economic jargon is concerned, with terms such as the bear and bull market commonly used to highlight expansionist and protectionist tendencies of corporations and companies. By way of an analogy, we are presented that the market, with all its commodities and services, bears the same relation to individual subjects as belief does to consciousness. And with this we reach the conclusion to the first section of this chapter, Immanence and Nominalism in Postmodern Theoretical Discourse. This section, being an entry into the new historicist movement in literature and its relation to, or rather emphasis on, and construction of immanence in new ways. The next reading, Part 2, Deconstruction as Nominalism, will be covered in the following reading. Thank you for your time. I'll leave the copy of the text itself in the description, and I'll meet you in the next video.